Today we'll cover the last lesson in chapter 13, which is the age of science and exploration. And in section 3, we are learning about the European empires. Specifically, we learned about Spain and Portugal. And this lesson is about the Atlantic slave trade that has something to do with the trading post and the trading system that was established by the Portuguese and the Spaniards during this time. Have your books ready or go to Loda USD website and launch Clever and log into Cengage Learning with your student account and password. And if you have your textbook, I think it will be better if you have a textbook near you so that you can easily access the information from the book as you listen to this discussion. So in your book, Unit 5, Chapter 13, Section 3, Lesson 3, pages 376 to 377. Chapter 13's essential question is, how did new ideas affect Europeans' views of the world? And the objective of this lesson is to explain why Europeans imported and enslaved millions of Africans in the New World. And by the New World, we mean the Americas, primarily South America, and then later to the northern part, specifically the 13 colonies. So to have a better grasp of what this Atlantic slave trade is, there is no need for us to reinvent the wheel. Ted Ed made a wonderful presentation with graphics and animation that will help us understand what this slave trade is. Please pay attention to this presentation.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy. The Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean, but the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, The captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare, but the Europeans who preached a universal religion and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact has continued long after its abolition.
So, to increase their profits, European plantations in the New World needed the cheap supply of workers. Lesson 3.3 explained how Europeans imported and enslaved millions of Africans to supply that labor. Around this time, many places around the world, warfare is very common. And so in West Africa, rulers or warlords grew rich by kidnapping and selling their enemies to Europeans. So instead of executing them, instead of killing them, they made a profit out of them. So in return for their captives, the rulers receive gold, trinkets, and guns that they will use for their warfares and to kidnap more of their enemies and send them as slaves by selling them to the Europeans. So by 1650, more than 40 trading posts on Africa's west coast were sending slaves to the New World. So this trading post formed part of the Transatlantic trading network known as the Triangular Trade. On the first leg of the triangle, European ships carried cheap manufactured goods to West Africa, where they were used to buy slaves. On the second of the middle leg of the triangle, these slaves were brought to the Americas, where they were sold for huge profit. And on the third leg of this triangle, the slave ships returned to European laden with valuable sugar, tobacco, coffee, and cotton. So cotton was used in the cottage industry for making cloth. If you will take a careful look at this picture, you will see the different products that are being imported and exported to different places from these four major continents. So we have South America and North, and we also have Europe and Africa. So slaves are coming from West Africa, and most of them will go to South America to work in the plantation out there, sugarcane plantation. And there are products that will be brought to North America, and from North America will be sent to back to Europe. and other stuff that they use for payment in purchasing slaves in West Africa will come from the European continent. So although there are four continents mentioned here, it only form a triangular system because we included both South and North America. So let's talk about the impact of the slave trade. So Europeans treated African slaves as property and not people. The slaves had no rights and their owners could treat them any way they wanted. This system of slavery was based on both custom and racism, the belief that some races are better than others. Europeans generally believed that they were superior and justified slavery as a way of civilizing Africans. It's unthinkable that up to 600 slaves were chained together in dark, overcrowded holds where it was impossible to move and difficult to even breathe. The crossing from Africa to the Americas took at least 3 weeks, and often as long as 3 months. So the trip became known as the Middle Passage because it was considered in the middle of the leg of the triangular trade. So an estimated 13 to 20% of slaves died on the voyage from hunger, thirst, disease, suffocation, drowning, and abuse. As for those who will manage to survive on sugar plantations, death rates were especially high due to overwork, poor nutrition, harsh treatment, and disease. But colonists grew rich by using slaves to produce sugar, tobacco, coffee, cotton, and to mine gold and silver and diamonds. Remember the Portugal Empire. So the number of people forced into slavery in the transatlantic slave trade is really shocking. So slave traders took entire villages and ethnic groups in Africa, destroying the whole communities by physically destroying it and eventually erasing the cultures because there are no people who will continue that very rich and colorful culture. Over a period of time, about maybe 360 years from 1501 to 1867, more than 12 million Africans were forced into slavery. It was the largest forced migration of people in history, the largest. Now let's take a look at the slave ships in the Middle Passage that we were talking about. So chained below the slave ships are slaves who could not even stand up or move. They were only taken above deck for a brief period of time. And the reason for that is really not for humanitarian reason. It's generally for their slaves not to die because these are investments. In other words, they were doing that not because they pity on them, but because they are afraid to lose their investments because they consider these human beings as their properties. So that was a stain in our history where a lot of people had to go through that horrible treatment, subhuman treatment from other people in the name of profit. So that is the Atlantic slave trade. Now let's go to the review and assess questions. The first one, as for the reading check, how did the transatlantic slave trade affect Africans and Europeans? That is very easy. Should be very easy to answer. Number two, this requires a little bit of thinking. And I am so interested to know your response to this one. Now, number two requires a little bit of thinking process than number one, I guess. Identify problems and solutions. So instead of using slaves, here's the question. How might Europeans have solved their labor shortage problem in the New World? That is the question. In other words, I want you to come up with an idea of solving the labor problem instead of using slaves for this labor shortage in the New World. And for number three, it should be easy. Analyze visuals. What hardships did African slaves endure on the Middle Passage? So I want you to take a look at this picture again, the Middle Passage, and come up with a description of how the African slaves endured the Middle Passage. Now go back to the Google Classroom and find the review and assess assignment for section 3 and answer the questions that I just read. Obviously, to get the full credit, you have to fill in all the important information here and answer the questions correctly using your own words in complete sentences. So since this is the last slide, the last lesson in this assignment, don't forget to turn it in once you have completed it. So this is section 3.3 of chapter 13, the Atlantic slave trade.